The examination hall smelled like fear and recycled air. Danny Wright sat in row 12, seat 47, surrounded by beings from at least 30 different worlds. Some had tentacles instead of hands. Others had scales, fur, or skin that changed colors with their emotions. A few breathed different gases and wore environmental suits. But they all shared one thing in common. They were all terrified of failing this test. The Interstellar Academy on Station Harmony was known for its brutal xenobiology certification program. Only 40% of candidates passed on their first attempt. The rest either failed or ended up in medical facilities after panic attacks. Danny watched a tall Quillen in the front row nervously tap 4 of its 6 fingers against the desk. The crystalline being next to Danny kept making a high-pitched humming sound that probably meant stress in its species. Danny felt fine. Actually, he felt a little bored. He had arrived at the station 3 days earlier from Callisto, one of Jupiter's moons. The journey took 2 weeks in a cramped transport ship, and he spent most of it sleeping or reading adventure novels. His parents had hugged him goodbye at the launch facility. His little sister Amy had cried and made him promise to come home soon. His father had given him one last piece of advice. Trust what you know, not what the books say. Now Danny understood why the other candidates looked so worried. The exam hall was massive with curved walls that displayed slowly rotating holographic images of alien creatures. Some looked harmless, like floating jellyfish or fuzzy caterpillars. Others looked like nightmares, all teeth and claws and armored plates. Each student had a data tablet and a question booklet printed on actual paper, which was apparently more secure than digital formats for important certifications. The proctor entered through the main door. His name was Brevet, according to the identification badge floating above his head. He was a Quillen, which meant he looked something like an upright octopus mixed with a business executive. His skin was a professional shade of gray-blue, and his movements were precise and methodical. He carried himself with the authority of someone who had administered this exam thousands of times. Brevet's voice came through the translation devices everyone wore. It sounded calm but firm, like a teacher who expected obedience but not friendship. He explained the rules. 3 hours to complete 200 questions. Each question would show a holographic creature. Students had to identify the species, rate its threat level from 1 to 10, and list proper containment protocols. No talking. No looking at other tablets. No using external databases. Danny glanced at his tablet as it powered on. The first question appeared immediately. A holographic projection materialized above his desk, showing a small lizard-like creature with purple scales and 6 eyes. Easy. That was a Venusian acid spitter, threat level 3, contained using alkaline barriers and maintained at temperatures below 15 degrees. Danny typed his answer and moved on. Question 2 showed a worm the size of a bus with rotating teeth rings. Proxima mining worm, threat level 5, contained using sonic dampeners and kept away from metal surfaces. Danny's fingers moved quickly across the tablet. Around him, other students were taking much longer. The Quillen in front was still on question 1, scrolling through reference images on the allowed database. The crystalline being had started question 2, but kept deleting and rewriting its answer. Someone 3 rows back made a sound like a strangled cough, which was probably how their species expressed frustration. Danny worked through 20 questions in the first 30 minutes. Most were creatures he had read about or seen in documentary feeds. A few were species he had actually encountered during supply runs to other colonies. The test was difficult, sure, but not impossible. He started to understand why his parents had insisted he take this exam. If he passed, he could legally handle xenobiology specimens, which meant better job opportunities and more freedom to continue his family's work. Question 37 made him smile. The hologram showed a massive creature that looked like a bear crossed with a tank, covered in crystalline armor plates. That was a Kepler ice burrower, threat level 7, contained using thermal shock systems and gravitational restraints. Danny had seen one of these once during a research expedition. It had tried to eat their transport vehicle, but got distracted by a deposit of frozen methane. Beautiful creatures, really, if you appreciated functional evolution. The exam continued. Danny settled into a rhythm. Read the question, identify the creature, type the answer, move on. Some questions were tricky, showing juvenile forms of species that looked different from adults or subspecies that required careful observation to distinguish. But nothing stumped him completely. Then question 83 appeared on his screen, and the entire atmosphere in the examination hall changed. The hologram materialized slowly, as if the system needed extra processing power to render it properly. What emerged made several students gasp out loud. One candidate dropped their tablet. Another started making a clicking sound that the translation device interpreted as a prayer in their native language. The creature in the hologram was enormous, even in miniature projection. It had 6 legs, each ending in claws that looked like they could tear through ship hulls. Its body was covered in obsidian black scales that seemed to absorb light. 3 rows of serrated teeth filled a mouth large enough to swallow a human whole. A spiked tail, easily 15 feet long in real life, curved behind its body like a scorpion's stinger. But the worst part was its eyes. They glowed with a predatory intelligence that made it clear this was not some mindless beast. This was a hunter that thought, planned, and remembered. The translation text appeared below the hologram. Identify this creature, provide threat classification, and describe containment protocols. Danny looked at the projection for exactly 3 seconds. Then he grinned, picked up his stylus, and wrote one word in the answer field. Fluffy. The crystalline student next to him leaned slightly to see his screen, then jerked back so hard it nearly fell off its chair. The gesture attracted attention from others nearby. Within moments, 5 different species were staring at Danny's answer, with expressions that universally translated to shock and horror. Danny ignored them and moved on to question 84. 3 years earlier, Danny had been kneeling in frozen mud at the edge of his family's property, staring at something that would change his entire life. The methane marsh stretched out before him like a sheet of cracked glass, reflecting Jupiter's enormous presence in the black sky above. Callisto was cold even by moon standards, and the Wright family farm sat on the absolute edge of habitable territory. Beyond their fence line, nothing lived except extremophile bacteria and the occasional ice formation that looked almost alive in the right light. But something was living in the marsh now, something that definitely should not be there. Danny had come out to check the irrigation pumps when he spotted them. 7 large objects, each roughly the size of a beer barrel, partially buried in the frozen slush. At first he thought they might be storage containers that had fallen off a transport ship. But as he got closer, he realized they were organic. Eggs. Huge, leathery eggs with surfaces that seemed to pulse with internal heat. He ran back to the main habitat module, his boots crunching on ice crystals. His parents were in the greenhouse section, arguing about whether their latest crop of hybrid wheat could survive another temperature drop. His little sister, Amy, was supposed to be doing homework, but was actually building a fort out of storage crates. Ruth Wright looked up as Danny burst through the airlock. She was a practical woman who rarely showed surprise, but her eyebrows went up when Danny described what he had found. His father, Owen, immediately grabbed a specimen kit and followed Danny back to the marsh. Ruth came too after making Amy promise not to leave the habitat. The 3 of them stood in a semicircle around the eggs, breath fogging in the thin atmosphere, even through their environment suits. Owen ran a scanner over the nearest egg while Ruth took tissue samples from the leathery surface. Danny just watched, fascinated by the way the eggs seemed to radiate warmth despite the freezing temperatures around them. Owen's scanner beeped 3 times, then displayed a message that made him curse. Ruth looked at her own analysis tablet and her face went pale. She showed the screen to Owen without saying anything. Danny finally asked what they had found. His parents exchanged a long look, the kind that meant they were having an entire conversation without words. Then his father sighed and showed Danny the scanner results. The eggs belonged to a species called shadow maw apex predators, native to a death world designated as Nix 9. They were classified as Category 5 threats, which was the highest danger rating the Galactic Biological Survey used. Category 5 meant that trained military personnel with heavy weapons had a 50-50 chance of surviving an encounter. It meant that entire research outposts had been abandoned after shadow maw attacks. It meant these creatures were considered functionally impossible to contain or control. Ruth said they should report the eggs immediately. Owen agreed in principle, but pointed out that the nearest Colonial Authority office was 3 weeks away by shuttle, and the eggs were clearly close to hatching. By the time officials arrived, whatever was inside would already be born. Ruth argued that was exactly why they needed to report it now, before something dangerous emerged. Owen countered that if they reported it, the authorities would likely just destroy the eggs without studying them, which seemed like a waste of a unique opportunity. Danny listened to his parents debate for 20 minutes. Finally, he asked a simple question. What if the eggs hatched and the creatures were not dangerous? What if the galactic classification was wrong? Both parents stared at him. Ruth started to explain that centuries of research backed up the threat classification, that thousands of qualified xenobiologists had studied shadow moths, that there was no chance the entire galactic community was wrong about these creatures. But Owen interrupted her. He reminded Ruth about the time they had successfully domesticated those Proxima mining worms that everyone said were mindless eating machines. He mentioned the ice burrowers that now helped them excavate new greenhouse sections, even though the textbooks claimed they could not be trained. Ruth was not convinced, but she was listening. Owen pressed his advantage. He suggested they keep the eggs, monitor them closely, and see what hatched. If the creatures showed immediate aggression, they could be contained or eliminated. But if there was even a chance to learn something new, to potentially discover that shadow moths were not the monsters everyone believed, would that not be worth the risk? Danny watched his mother think. He knew that look. She was weighing danger against discovery, protocol against possibility. Ruth Wright had never been one to follow rules simply because they existed. She had built her career on finding exceptions to established biological assumptions. Finally, Ruth made her decision. They would keep the eggs. They would study whatever hatched. But at the first sign of genuine danger, they would end the experiment immediately. Owen agreed. Danny promised to follow every safety protocol they established. They built a containment area in the farm's largest storage module, installing temperature controls and reinforced barriers. Owen rigged up monitoring equipment to track the eggs' development. Ruth created detailed observation logs and started researching everything the galactic databases had on shadow moths, which turned out to be mostly disaster reports and warnings. The eggs hatched 4 days later in the middle of the night. The habitat's alarm system woke everyone up. Danny rushed to the storage module with his parents, expecting chaos and destruction. Instead, they found 6 small creatures, each about the size of a terrier dog, stumbling around on unsteady legs. They had miniature versions of the fearsome features described in the database: scales, claws, teeth. But they looked vulnerable, confused, and surprisingly cute in the way that all baby animals manage to be cute despite their features. One of the creatures, slightly larger than its siblings, looked directly at Danny. Its eyes, which would eventually glow with predatory intelligence, were currently just curious and a bit scared. It made a sound, something between a chirp and a growl, and took a wobbly step toward him. Danny's mother grabbed his arm, ready to pull him back. His father had a neural stunner drawn just in case, but Danny knelt down slowly and extended his hand. The creature sniffed his fingers, then rubbed its head against his palm. Danny looked up at his parents and said, "I'm going to call this one Fluffy." 18 months after the eggs hatched, Fluffy had grown into something that would give nightmares to trained soldiers across the galaxy. Danny stood in the main yard of the farm, watching Fluffy play with Amy. His little sister was 7 years old now, laughing as she threw a gravity ball across the ice field. Fluffy, all 3 tons of obsidian-scaled apex predator, bounded after it like an oversized puppy. When she caught the ball in her massive jaws, she trotted back to Amy and gently dropped it at the girl's feet. Her tail, tipped with spikes that could puncture ship armor, wagged back and forth in obvious pleasure. The other 5 shadow moths were scattered around the property, each engaged in their own activities. Spike was helping Owen repair a section of the perimeter fence, using his considerable strength to lift support beams into place. Princess was being groomed by Ruth, who had discovered that shadow moths actually enjoyed having their scales cleaned and polished. Chomper was in the food storage area, demonstrating her ability to open complex lock mechanisms in exchange for treats. Sweetie was napping in a sunny spot near the greenhouse, her body generating enough heat to melt a circle in the ice around her. Brutus, the laziest of the 6, was sprawled across the habitat entrance like a very intimidating doormat. Danny had spent every day of the past year and a half working with these creatures. What started as a risky experiment had become his entire life. He woke up early to feed them, spent his afternoons training them, and fell asleep most nights in the barn with at least 2 shadow moths curled up nearby for warmth. The Galactic Xenobiology database said shadow moths were solitary hunters who tolerated each other only during mating season. Danny's experience suggested the database was completely wrong. The 6 siblings had formed a tight pack with clear social structures. Fluffy was the leader, making decisions and settling disputes. Spike was her second, enforcing rules and protecting the others. Princess was the social coordinator, the one who initiated play and grooming. Chomper was the problem solver, always figuring out new ways to get food or entertainment. Sweetie was the gentle one, often comforting the others when they were stressed. Brutus was the lazy one who somehow still managed to be exactly where he needed to be during important moments. The database also said shadow moths had the intelligence of Earth's great apes. Danny thought that was another massive underestimation. These creatures understood complex verbal commands in 3 languages now. They could solve puzzles that stumped some of the farm's automated systems. Fluffy had figured out how to operate door controls by watching humans do it twice. Chomper had learned to trade, bringing interesting rocks or ice formations to Ruth in exchange for extra food portions. Most importantly, they had never shown aggression toward humans. Not once. Not even when Amy accidentally stepped on Brutus's tail, or when Owen had to remove an infected claw from Spike's foot, or when Ruth took blood samples for her research. Other frontier farmers had started visiting the Wright property. Word spreading through the isolated moon colonies about the impossible creatures that lived there. Some visitors were skeptical, arriving with weapons and suspicious expressions. Others were curious, wanting to understand how a Category 5 species could behave like domestic animals. All of them left with the same confused look on their faces, trying to reconcile what they had seen with what they thought they knew about dangerous predators. Old Howard from the mining station 200 kilometers north had visited 3 times. He was a veteran of the frontier wars and had killed more hostile creatures than he could count. The first time he saw Fluffy, he drew his plasma rifle on instinct. But then Amy had run up to Fluffy, hugged one of her massive legs, and asked if Mr. Howard wanted to play fetch with them. Howard had stood there for 5 full minutes, rifle still drawn, watching a child play with a creature that should have eaten her. He finally holstered his weapon, sat down on a cargo crate, and asked Owen for something strong to drink. The second time Howard visited, he brought his wife, who was a xenobiologist with 40 years of field experience. She spent an entire day running tests, taking measurements and interviewing Danny about his training methods. At the end of the day, she told the Wright family that nothing they were doing should work according to any established theory. The shadow moths should have killed someone by now, or at least shown territorial aggression. Instead, they behaved like a cross between working dogs and extremely deadly house cats. The third time Howard visited, he brought a contract. A mining consortium needed help clearing out a nest of rock borers that were destroying their equipment. Rock borers were tough creatures, but not particularly smart. Howard thought the shadow moths might be able to scare them away without anyone getting hurt. He was offering enough credits to buy a new habitat module. Owen and Ruth discussed it for 2 days. Danny argued that the shadow moths needed challenges, needed to use their natural abilities. Keeping them on the farm doing simple tasks was like asking a calculator to only count to 10. Eventually, his parents agreed, but only if Danny went along to supervise and only if they took extensive safety precautions. The mining job turned out to be the easiest credits the Wright family ever earned. Fluffy and Spike walked into the rock borer tunnels, roared once, and every borer in a 5-kilometer radius fled in panic. The miners were amazed. They had expected a fight, maybe some casualties. Instead, the problem was solved in less than an hour. Word spread even faster after that. More job offers came in. Could the shadow moths help clear ice formations from landing pads? Could they provide security for a supply depot that kept getting raided by wild creatures? Could they help search for survivors after a habitat collapse? The answer to all these questions turned out to be yes. Danny started keeping a log of everything the shadow moths accomplished. Not just for the family records, but because he had a feeling this information might be important someday. Every job completed, every creature they interacted with peacefully, every moment that proved the galactic database was wrong about them. His father noticed the log one evening and asked Danny what he planned to do with all that information. Danny had shrugged and said maybe nothing, maybe everything. He was 17 years old, nearly 18, and starting to think about his future beyond the farm. If he wanted to keep working with shadow moths, if he wanted to prove to the galaxy that these creatures deserved better than to be labeled as monsters, he would need credentials. He would need certification. He would need to pass the xenobiology handler's license exam. Owen had smiled and told Danny that was a fine goal, but it would not be easy. The exam was notoriously difficult, and showing up with 6 illegal Category 5 creatures as practical experience might cause problems. Danny had looked out at the yard where Fluffy was teaching Amy how to track footprints in the ice, and said he would figure it out. After all, everyone said shadow maws were impossible to train, and he had managed that just fine. The corporate survey ship appeared in Callisto's orbit on a Tuesday, which was laundry day at the Wright farm, and Ruth was particularly annoyed about the timing. Danny was hanging thermal suits on the drying rack when the habitat's proximity alarm started beeping. Visitors were not unusual anymore, but most of them sent a message first. This ship had just appeared, running what looked like detailed scans of the entire moon surface. Owen pulled up the identification transponder, and his face went carefully neutral, which was never a good sign. The ship belonged to Helix Biosystems, one of the largest xenobiology research corporations in the galaxy. They held contracts with most planetary governments for biological surveys and threat assessments. They were professional, wealthy, powerful, and absolutely not the kind of people the Wright family wanted noticing their farm. 6 hours later, a shuttle landed in the main yard. Fluffy and the other shadow maws had been outside when the alarms first sounded, and they immediately formed a protective perimeter around the habitat. Danny had trained them for this scenario, though he had hoped they would never need to use it. The creatures looked alert but not aggressive, watching the shuttle with focused attention. The shuttle door opened and 8 figures emerged. 5 were security personnel in full combat armor, carrying weapons that could probably take down a small building. 2 were scientists in environment suits, laden with scanning equipment. The 8th was a tall Archean woman who walked with the confidence of someone used to being in charge. Her name, according to the identification beacon, was Dr. Fallen. Owen went out to meet them, gesturing for Ruth to stay inside with Amy. Danny followed his father, partly because he wanted to help and partly because Fluffy would not let him stay behind. The massive shadow maw walked beside Danny, her presence a clear statement of protection. Dr. Fallen stopped walking when she saw Fluffy. The security team immediately raised their weapons. The scientists started making rapid notes on their tablets. Danny could see the exact moment when Dr. Fallen realized what she was looking at, because her expression changed from professional curiosity to genuine alarm. She spoke in a calm voice, but Danny could hear the tension underneath. She identified herself as the chief xenobiologist for this sector and explained that their survey had detected genetic signatures belonging to shadow maw apex predators. This was impossible, of course, because shadow maws were a restricted species that could not legally be removed from their native world. There must be some mistake in their scanning equipment. Owen, who was good at talking to difficult people, agreed that it did sound impossible. Then he casually mentioned that the scans were probably picking up the 6 shadow maws that lived on his farm. Would Dr. Fallen like to come inside for something to drink while they discussed the situation? The silence that followed lasted approximately 10 seconds. Then Dr. Fallen started giving orders in rapid succession. The security team was to establish a perimeter. The scientists were to confirm the genetic readings. She was personally going to inspect these alleged shadow maws, and if they were real, the creatures would be destroyed immediately according to galactic safety protocols. Danny felt Fluffy tense beside him. The other 5 shadow maws moved closer, forming a tighter circle. They were not growling or showing teeth, but their body language had shifted from watchful to protective. Spike positioned himself between the security team and Amy, who had disobeyed Ruth's instructions and come outside. Princess moved to block the path to the greenhouses. Chomper, Sweetie, and Brutus spread out to cover the other approaches. Dr. Fallen noticed the movement. Her hand moved toward a weapon on her belt. The security team adjusted their aim, targeting systems painting laser dots across Fluffy's massive body. Danny could feel the situation spiraling toward violence, and he did the only thing he could think of. He stepped in front of Fluffy and told everyone to calm down. His voice came out steadier than he expected. He explained that the shadow maws were not dangerous, that they had lived peacefully with his family for 2 years, that they helped with farm work and had never hurt anyone. Dr. Fallen looked at him like he had just claimed he could breathe vacuum without a suit. She informed Danny, in the tone of someone explaining basic facts to a child, that shadow maws were Category 5 threats with a documented history of killing trained personnel. They were biologically incapable of domestication. Their aggression was hardwired into their neural structure. What he was claiming was literally impossible. According to centuries of xenobiological research, Danny suggested that maybe the research was wrong. Dr. Fallen's expression made it clear what she thought of that idea. Owen tried to de-escalate by offering to demonstrate the shadow maws training. Dr. Fallen refused, stating that any moment these creatures could revert to their natural behavior and slaughter everyone present. She had seen the aftermath of shadow maw attacks. She knew what these creatures were capable of. She had a legal responsibility to eliminate threats. And 6 Category 5 predators living on an unsecured civilian farm definitely qualified as a threat. Ruth emerged from the habitat at that point, carrying a datapad loaded with 2 years of research documentation. She started presenting evidence: behavioral observations, training logs, medical records, footage of the shadow maws working alongside humans. Dr. Fallen barely glanced at it. She had made up her mind. The security team moved closer, weapons charging. Fluffy lowered her head and made a sound deep in her chest. Not quite a growl, but close. The other shadow maws responded, their movements coordinated and purposeful. Danny realized with growing horror that Dr. Fallen was going to force a confrontation. And if shooting started, people were going to die. Maybe his family, maybe the security team. Definitely his shadow maws. Amy, who had been watching everything with wide eyes, suddenly ran forward. She ducked under her father's arm, dodged past Danny, and threw herself against Fluffy's front leg in a fierce hug. She told Dr. Fallen that Fluffy was nice and that the doctor could not hurt her. 7 security personnel and the most respected xenobiologist in the sector stared at a 7-year-old child hugging a 3-ton apex predator that could bite her in half without effort. Fluffy, for her part, carefully curled her neck around to nuzzle Amy's hair with her massive snout, making sure not to accidentally scratch the girl with her teeth. Dr. Fallen's weapon remained drawn, but Danny saw something change in her expression. Not belief exactly, more like the first crack in absolute certainty. She lowered her weapon and made a new proposal. The shadow maws would not be destroyed today, but this situation could not continue as it was. Danny would need to obtain a xenobiology handler's license to legally keep Category 5 creatures. The family would need to present their research to the Galactic Council, and Dr. Fallen herself would remain on the farm for 1 week to observe these impossible creatures. If she saw any signs of aggression, any indication that the shadow maws posed a danger, she would personally ensure they were removed to a maximum security facility. It was not the outcome Danny wanted, but it was better than watching Fluffy and her siblings die. He agreed to the terms. His parents agreed. Even Amy, still hugging Fluffy's leg, nodded seriously. Dr. Fallen ordered her security team to stand down but maintain alert status. She told her scientists to begin setting up monitoring equipment. Then she looked at Danny and asked the question that would determine everything. If these creatures were truly as trained as he claimed, would Fluffy obey a command right now, with weapons pointed at her and strangers threatening her pack? Danny met Fluffy's glowing eyes. He gave a simple hand signal, one they had practiced thousands of times. Fluffy sat down, tail curling around her body, and waited. The examination hall erupted into chaos the moment word spread about Danny's answer. Brevet, the Quillen Proctor, stood frozen at the front of the hall, staring at his monitoring tablet like it had personally betrayed him. The screen showed Danny's response to question 83 in bright red text. Fluffy. Just that one word, no threat classification. No containment protocols, just a name that sounded like something you would call a pet rabbit. The crystalline student next to Danny made a sound like breaking glass, which the translation device rendered as distressed confusion. A Vexarian 3 rows back stood up so fast her chair fell over. She started shouting in her native language, and even without translation, Danny could tell she was upset. Other students were pulling up their own databases, trying to understand if this was some kind of joke or if the human had genuinely lost his mind. Brevet finally recovered enough to speak. His voice, usually so calm and professional, had developed a slight tremor. He announced that the examination was temporarily suspended and asked Danny to remain in his seat. All other students were instructed to take a break in the waiting area. The request was phrased politely, but the security personnel who appeared at the doorways made it clear this was not optional. The exam hall emptied quickly, students filing out while casting nervous glances at Danny. Some looked curious. Others looked scared. A few looked angry, as if Danny had somehow insulted them by not taking the test seriously. The crystalline being patted Danny's shoulder with one of its appendages as it left, a gesture that seemed sympathetic. When everyone else was gone, Brevet walked slowly down the aisle to Danny's desk. 2 security guards followed at a respectful distance. The proctor's skin had shifted from professional gray-blue to a troubled purple color. He gestured at Danny's tablet with one tentacle. Brevet asked if Danny understood what he had written. Danny said yes. The proctor asked if Danny knew what a shadow maw apex predator was. Danny said yes again. Brevet's skin color deepened to almost violet.
He asked if Danny was aware that his answer to question 83 would result in automatic exam failure and possible psychological evaluation. Danny explained,
in simple terms, that he was not joking or confused. The creature in the hologram was indeed a shadow maw, and her name was Fluffy. He had raised her from an egg. She lived on his family's farm on Callisto. She was well-trained, friendly, and excellent at herding cattle. Brevet's tentacles went completely still, which Danny had learned meant Aquilin was either deep in thought or experiencing system shock. The proctor pulled up Danny's application file on his tablet and began reading through it with increasing agitation. His skin color cycled through purple to green to orange, settling finally on a pale yellow that Danny guessed meant surprise. The proctor's voice was barely above a whisper when he asked if everything in the application file was true. Danny confirmed it was. The 6 shadow maws, the training documentation, the work records, the recommendation letters from frontier colonies, all of it was real and verifiable. Brevet made a series of clicking sounds that the translator did not bother to interpret, probably because they were the Quillen equivalent of swearing. He tapped his tablet several times, and Danny heard his voice being transmitted to someone else. Within minutes, a holographic projection appeared at the front of the exam hall. It showed Dr. Fallen, the Archean xenobiologist who had spent a week on the Wright farm observing Fluffy and the others. Dr. Fallen looked tired, like she had been working for many hours without rest. But when she saw Danny, she smiled slightly. She confirmed to Brevet that everything in the application file was accurate. She had personally witnessed Daniel Wright working with 6 fully grown shadow maw apex predators. She had seen them follow commands, perform complex tasks, and interact peacefully with humans, including small children. She had submitted a detailed report to the Galactic Council, recommending that the Wright family's research be recognized officially. Brevet's skin color went through several more rapid changes. He asked Dr. Fallen how this was possible. She responded with a question of her own. Had Brevet ever considered that the galactic understanding of dangerous species might be fundamentally flawed? What followed was a conversation that Danny only partially understood. Dr. Fallen and Brevet discussed something called the domestication paradigm, referencing academic papers and research studies. Dr. Fallen argued that most spacefaring species had never needed to domesticate predators because they either evolved on peaceful worlds or developed technology fast enough to avoid that stage. Humans, she claimed, were different. Earth was what she called a Class 7 death world, and humans had survived by making allies of creatures that should have killed them. Brevet wanted to know what this meant for the examination. Dr. Fallen's answer was simple. Daniel Wright probably knew more about handling Category 5 creatures than anyone else in the galaxy. His answer to question 83 was not wrong. It was just operating from a completely different knowledge base than the standardized test expected. The proctor asked what he should do. Dr. Fallen suggested something that made Danny sit up straighter. Bring in a live specimen. If Danny could demonstrate his abilities in a controlled environment, it would prove his claims beyond any doubt. If he failed or if the situation became dangerous, they would at least learn the truth before anyone took his application seriously. Brevet looked horrified at the suggestion. Bringing a Category 5 predator onto station, Harmony violated at least 40 safety regulations. Dr. Fallen pointed out that they had already violated several hundred regulations by allowing Danny to take the exam without flagging his application for special review. They might as well commit fully to breaking protocol. The proctor spent 5 full minutes thinking, his skin cycling through colors that Danny could not interpret. Finally, Brevet agreed to the demonstration. He would need authorization from station security, medical personnel on standby and evacuation protocols ready. But if Dr. Fallon believed this was necessary, he would trust her judgment. Dr. Fallon's hologram smiled. She told Brevet she had already arranged for Fluffy to be transported to Station Harmony. The Shadow Maw was currently in a secure cargo bay, sedated for the journey, and would be ready for the demonstration in approximately 4 hours. She had suspected this situation might arise. Danny could not help but grin. Dr. Fallon had changed significantly since her first visit to the farm. Back then she had wanted to destroy the Shadow Maws. Now she was actively helping prove they were not the monsters everyone believed. A week of observation had been enough to transform her from skeptic to advocate. Brevet dismissed Danny to a waiting room while preparations were made. The next 4 hours were the longest of Danny's life. He tried to read, could not focus. He tried to sleep, was too nervous. He paced back and forth, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. What if Fluffy reacted badly to the station environment? What if being around so many strangers stressed her out? What if she proved everyone right by showing aggression? He trusted Fluffy completely, but he also knew she was still a Shadow Maw, still a predator with instincts hardwired into her biology. If something went wrong, people could die, and his entire family's work would be dismissed as a dangerous delusion. A security officer finally came to collect him. The demonstration area was ready. Dr. Fallon had arrived in person. Medical teams were standing by. Station security had cleared 3 entire sections and established evacuation routes. Half the Galactic Council was watching via remote feed. No pressure or anything. Danny was escorted to what looked like a cargo bay that had been converted into an arena. Reinforced barriers surrounded a large open space. Observation platforms circled the area at a safe height. Dozens of beings from different species watched from behind protective shields. At the far end of the bay was a massive containment cell, the kind usually reserved for the most dangerous criminals or hostile xenofauna. Inside that cell, Danny could see a familiar shape. Fluffy, looking groggy from sedation but otherwise healthy, her obsidian scales reflecting the harsh lighting. Brevet's voice echoed through the bay's speaker system. He explained the parameters of the demonstration. The containment cell would open. If Daniel Wright could prove that the Shadow Maw was trained and non-aggressive, his examination would continue under special review. If the creature showed hostility, or if the situation became dangerous, she would be resedated and returned to containment. Danny barely heard the rest of the announcement. He was focused entirely on Fluffy, who had just noticed him in the arena. Her glowing eyes found his, and even from across the bay, Danny could see her tail start to move in what was almost certainly the beginning of a wag. The containment cell opened with a hydraulic hiss. Every being in the observation platforms tensed. Security personnel aimed weapons loaded with enough tranquilizer to drop an elephant. Medical teams prepared for casualties. Fluffy stepped out of the cell slowly, her massive form moving with predatory grace. She tested the air with her senses, taking in all the new smells and sounds. Her body language showed uncertainty, maybe a little stress from the strange environment and the sedatives wearing off. Then she looked directly at Danny again. Her expression changed completely. The uncertainty vanished. She made that deep rumbling purr that Danny had heard 1,000 times before, and she walked straight toward him, ignoring everyone else in the arena. The weapons tracked her movement. Dr. Fallon held up a hand, signaling the security team to wait. Brevet's skin had gone completely white. Fluffy reached Danny and did exactly what she always did when they had been apart. She lowered her enormous head and nuzzled against his chest hard enough to nearly knock him over. Then she sat down beside him, leaned her weight against his legs, and looked up at the observation platforms with an expression that clearly communicated she was bored with all these dramatic strangers. The arena was completely silent for 3 full seconds. Then Dr. Fallon started laughing, the sound echoing through the speakers. Several beings in the observation platforms collapsed into their seats. One made a sound that the translators rendered as impossible, repeated about 15 times. Danny scratched behind Fluffy's jaw ridge, exactly where she liked it, and asked Brevet if they could continue with the examination now. 6 months later, Danny stood in front of a classroom containing the most diverse group of students he had ever seen, and tried not to laugh at their terrified expressions. The Interstellar Academy had expanded rapidly after Danny's demonstration. What started as a standard xenobiology program had transformed into something entirely new, the Human Integration Protocol for High-Risk Species. Danny was the youngest instructor in the Academy's history, and possibly the only one who brought his teaching assistant to class in the form of a 3-ton apex predator. Fluffy lay near the back of the classroom, her presence dominating the space despite her relaxed posture. She was technically asleep, but Danny knew she was aware of everything happening around her. The other 5 Shadow Maws had remained on Callisto with his family, but Fluffy had bonded so strongly with Danny that separating them seemed cruel. The Academy administration had agreed to her presence after extensive negotiations and approximately 50 safety reviews. The current class consisted of 12 students from 8 different species. A Quillen engineer who wanted to work with tunneling creatures, 2 Vexarian soldiers interested in training guard animals, an Archean xenobiologist following Dr. Fallen's research, a human from Mars who had heard about Danny's work, 3 beings from species Danny was still learning to pronounce correctly. All of them had signed up believing they would learn advanced containment techniques and threat management. Instead, Danny's first lesson was about respect. He explained that most galactic species approach dangerous creatures with the assumption that they needed to be controlled or contained. Humans, shaped by Earth's hostile environment, had learned a different approach. They looked at wolves and saw future dogs. They looked at wild cats and saw future companions. They looked at aurochs and saw future cattle. Where others saw threats, humans saw potential partners. One of the Vexarian students interrupted, her voice sharp with frustration. She pointed out that her people had tried to negotiate with Shadow Maws 200 years ago, and the creatures had destroyed an entire colony. How could Danny claim these beings were potential partners when history proved otherwise? Danny asked a simple question. Had her people tried to understand what the Shadow Maws wanted, or had they simply assumed the creatures were mindless killers? The Vexarian started to answer, then stopped. She admitted she did not know the details, only that many had died. Danny pulled up a historical file on the classroom display. It showed the incident report from the Vexarian colony. He pointed out several key details that most people overlooked. The colony had been established directly on top of Shadow Maw breeding grounds. The creatures had not attacked immediately, but had shown warning behaviors for 3 months. When those warnings were ignored, they defended their territory. The report framed it as an unprovoked massacre, but the evidence suggested it was actually a last resort. The Vexarian student stared at the report, her face showing an expression Danny had learned to recognize. It was the look of someone's worldview cracking open, letting in uncomfortable new possibilities. He spent the next hour demonstrating basic training principles with Fluffy. He showed how to read body language, how to establish trust through consistency, how to use positive reinforcement instead of punishment. The students watched in amazement as Fluffy performed complex commands, solved puzzles for treats, and even allowed strangers to touch her scales after Danny gave permission. The Quillen engineer asked the question they were all thinking. Why did this work for humans but not for other species? Danny's answer was both simple and complicated. Humans had spent thousands of years learning to see individual personalities in animals. Most species categorize creatures by threat level and nothing else. A Shadow Maw was a Category 5, end of discussion. But Danny saw Fluffy as an intelligent being with preferences, moods, and emotional needs. He told them about Princess, who was vain and loved being groomed. About Brutus, who was lazy but would protect Amy with his life. About Chomper, who solved problems for fun rather than food. Every Shadow Maw was different, just like every human was different. Treating them as identical threat units was like treating all humans as identical organisms. It missed the entire point. The classes continued 3 times a week. Students learned to work with creatures they had feared their entire lives. The Quillen engineer discovered that the giant tunneling worms of Sigma 9 were actually highly social and could be guided using scent markers and patience. The Vexarian soldiers realized that many aggressive species were simply defending resources or family units. The Archean xenobiologist wrote papers that challenged centuries of established theory. Word spread across the galaxy. Danny received messages from frontier colonies requesting consultations. Mining operations wanted advice on coexisting with local predators. Research stations asked for training on non-lethal interaction protocols. Even military organizations started questioning their approach to hostile xenofauna. Dr. Fallen visited frequently, now serving as Danny's mentor and advocate. She told him that his work was causing a revolution in xenobiology, that academic institutions were revising their textbooks, that the Galactic Council was establishing new guidelines for species classification. What had started with one human teenager and 6 illegally kept shadow maws was changing how the entire galaxy understood dangerous creatures. But the most satisfying moment came when Danny received a message from a frontier colony on the edge of known space. They had discovered a new species, something never catalogued before. Early observations suggested it was impossibly aggressive, with documented attacks on anyone who approached. The colony had requested military intervention to eliminate the threat, but someone had suggested consulting with Daniel Wright first. Danny read the report carefully, noting the patterns. The creatures attacked only when approached directly. They showed warning behaviors before engaging. They seemed to be protecting a specific geographical area. It all sounded familiar. He accepted the consultation contract immediately. The academy gave him a semester leave. He packed his equipment, said goodbye to his students, and prepared for the journey. Fluffy, sensing travel preparations, became excited. Her tail wagged hard enough to knock over a chair. On the last day before departure, Danny stood in the empty classroom and thought about how far he had come. 3 years ago, he had been a teenager on an isolated farm, raising creatures that everyone said were impossible to train. Now he was teaching the galaxy a new way to understand the dangerous and unknown. His datapad chimed with a message from his parents. They were proud of him, but they also wanted him to visit soon. Amy missed him. The farm missed him. Spike had learned a new trick. Princess had somehow figured out how to open the greenhouse door. Chomper had traded Ruth an interesting ice crystal for 3 portions of dried meat. Sweetie sent her love. Brutus was being lazy as usual. Danny smiled and sent a reply promising to visit after this consultation. He attached a photo of himself and Fluffy in front of the academy, both of them looking confident and ready for whatever came next. The response from Amy came immediately. A voice message of her 7-year-old voice declaring that Fluffy better not have more fun without her, and that Danny should bring back something cool from the new colony. And also, could he please come home soon, because none of the other Shadow Maws gave good hugs like Fluffy did. Danny saved the message and made a mental note to bring back something special for his sister. Maybe a rock from an alien world, maybe a plant sample, maybe a story about making friends with another impossible creature. He looked at Fluffy, who was watching him with those intelligent, glowing eyes. He scratched behind her jaw ridge and told her they had work to do. She made her rumbling purr sound and stood up, ready to follow him anywhere. They left the academy together, walking through hallways where students no longer flinched at the sight of a Shadow Maw. They passed classrooms where beings from across the galaxy learned to see individuals instead of threat categories. They headed toward the docking bay where a transport ship waited to take them to the frontier. Danny thought about the quote that had become famous after his examination demonstration. When asked why he named a Category 5 apex predator Fluffy, he had said, "Because that's who she is. The galaxy saw a monster. I saw a friend waiting to be made." That philosophy had changed everything. It had earned him his license, his teaching position, and his reputation. But more importantly, it had saved 6 lives that would have been destroyed simply because they were born as the wrong species. As they boarded the transport ship, Danny felt ready for whatever waited at the frontier colony. Another misunderstood species. Another opportunity to prove that dangerous did not mean evil, that aggressive did not mean unsalvageable, that with patience and respect even the most feared creatures could become partners. Fluffy settled into the cargo hold, which had been specially modified for her comfort. Danny sat beside her, feeling her warmth and her steady breathing. The ship's engines powered up. The journey would take 3 weeks. He pulled out his datapad and began reviewing the files on the new species. The galaxy still had so much to learn. Fortunately, Danny had time to teach them. 1 creature, 1 colony, 1 student at a time, until seeing individuals instead of categories became natural for everyone. The transport ship jumped to faster-than-light travel, carrying a human and his Shadow Maw toward another impossible situation that they would somehow make possible. Because that was what humans did best, making friends with things that wanted to eat them and changing the galaxy in the process.